Because there are exactly 435 seats, all the United States population by districts and states must fit into 435 districts. And so, if, for example, a million people move to Texas, lots of people are moving to Texas, um, say from California or New York, then those places are going to lose representation. For example, 10 years ago, California had 55. Now, for the US, it's a little sort of weird because if you also think about what we call the Electoral College has exactly 538 votes, which are equal to the number of districts, the number of Senate seats, plus 3 seats for the District of Columbia and I think Puerto Rico. And um, so, for example, California had 55 electoral votes, but since quite a number of people moved out, they lost a district. And so now they have, I think, 50. Actually, they lost a couple of districts. So now they have 53. Texas got some more districts. And so, again, sometimes when we think about presidential politics, there is that kind of interaction. Now, other countries are easier to govern and they don't have those kinds of things like the electoral college. For example, the United Kingdom, the party that has the most number of members of parliament, which would be the equivalent of representatives, forms the government. So, for example, at this point, it's the Labour government. Now, in other countries, for example, Israel has 120 seats in their parliament. It's called the Knesset. And so the party that has the most seats, or the coalition that has the most seats, is the one that usually forms the government. So, for example, right now and for the past maybe quite a number of years, the Likud party of Benjamin Netanyahu has been the one that has been that has more seats. Maybe not last Sunday. Was it last Sunday or the previous Sunday? Germany had elections because their previous government fell apart. The previous government was a coalition government between CSU and SPD and some other parties. And so in the US, you don't have coalition governments. In other countries, you have these kinds of coalition governments. And so, for example, in Israel, the majority is now 61 as opposed to 59. So if someone defects, you can trigger a motion of no confidence in the government. And so legislative systems vary by country. Some are easy to sort of think about, others are complex. The US one is actually pretty simple, but then you mix in the electoral college and it gets now under the executive, we mentioned that there are. So the executive is really the one that kind of determines how to execute the laws that have been passed by the legislatures. Now, right now we have seen the United States executive doing some things. So, for example, just last night, it was announced that there will be about 70,000 jobs cut from the Veterans Administration. And so, however we feel about that, these are functions of the administrative state, the machinery, the executive. So Congress makes the rules, or parliaments make the rules, and then the executive is the one that actually implements them. Now, the executive, for example, in parliamentary systems is slightly different. So, for example, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, members of parliament become cabinet ministers or cabinet secretaries. So for the US, cabinet secretaries come out from outside of the legislature. And so it's rare for you to see cabinet secretaries actually testifying, but in places like the United Kingdom, they actually have a weekly. So, for example, think about the address to the joint session of Congress on Tuesday. The US president visits Congress very rarely, probably once a year. In contrast, for example, in the UK, every week they have what they call the Prime Minister's questions. So the Prime Minister shows up and he has to answer questions from the members of Parliament. And so in that way, it's thought that the administrative state is more responsive to the people who represent the interests of the citizens, because MPs can ask questions. Now, but more broadly, administrative systems can be part of the executive, or in some places they are almost freestanding, but generally they are part of the executive. And so these are some of the things that administrative systems do. For example, provision of public goods, regulation and enforcement of behavior, information management and resource management. We have seen some of this. Now, when we think about, so a lot of people will say the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is the administrative state. And so when we sort of think about the bureaucracy, actually the word bureaucracy comes from the French word le bureau, which means desk. So kind of gives us the image of people sitting at desks doing things. Now, for when we talked about the form of the state and Weber's conception of the state, one of the things that he talks about besides monopoly over violence is the bureaucracy. So a functional state has to have a bureaucracy, but also processes that manage that bureaucracy. In other words, what are the processes that are going on in this bureaucracy? How do we pay taxes? Who collects the taxes? Who decides what roads are going to be built? For example, interstate highways. How are they funded? It's actually an interstate highway commission that works with states. And so, not sure if you've been to the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, which is being expanded. And so, if you sort of think about the mechanism that goes into all of that, like the interstate commission or the Interstate Highway Commission plus the state of Virginia. So these are bureaucratic processes that interact. And so for Weber, there are characteristics to bureaucracies, and I leave it up to you to figure out whether the current actions of the US government fulfill these Weberian criteria of specific rules of action. So for example, can you just fire people? Can you fire all probationary employees? That would be a bureaucratic function. But do the rules support that kind of thing? Is the bureaucracy rational? So for example, and I don't know how I got to this information, the president in his address talked about USAID money going to Lesotho, $8 million for LGBTQIA plus programs. Not passing judgment on anything, but for example, is that a rational use of taxpayers' dollars? Now, the bureaucracy right now has decided that it is not. Is the bureaucracy non-discretionary? Now, discretionary is things that you choose to do. Non-discretionary are things that are required. For example, Medicaid, Social Security, Medicare. Those are non-discretionary programs. Does the government have those kinds of programs? Or can the government or the bureaucracy come in and start or stop certain bureaucratic processes? For example, the people who are studying bird flu, can the government stop them? Is that even rational? Government bureaucracy should be predictable. So if you go to, say, DMV, there is a procedure. There are documents they are going to ask for in order for you to get your driver's license or ID. And so if you go today and find that they are asking for, say, your parents' birth certificate, that is not part of the predictability or the normal procedures of the bureaucracy. It's also impersonal, so it's really not personal. Whatever the government does. So, for example, you don't pay taxes because the government has something against you. These are the procedures of the bureaucracy. Um, Now, again, sometimes we talk about bureaucracies in very negative terms. So if you, a lot of times you'll hear bureaucracy conflated with red tape. In other words, processes that hinder what you're trying to do. If you run into bureaucratic processes, and I'm sure lots of institutions sometimes have those, and we all hate them. But so the important thing is that a bureaucracy is part of the administrative state, is part of the executive in most political systems. It has specific rules of actions. It's rational, non-discretionary, predictable, and impersonal. Um, Now, so when bureaucracies, so the executive branch, or say Congress does something, who decides if that thing is lawful or not? Who decides if it is lawful? And I really do hope that you are keeping track of, don't doom scroll the news, that's not helpful. But keep track of some of the things that relate to this course in your political science classes, because this government is actually demonstrating all of those things. For example, for the most part, agencies hire their own staff. They hire them and fire them if they are not performing as expected. And so, who decides that bureaucracies are violating these rules? Who enforces the rules? And so, this is where we find judiciaries, judicial structures. And so, judiciaries are ways of adjudicating or ways of interpreting the law. Now, this is why I decided to not become a lawyer. In 2015, there was a Supreme Court case over the Affordable Care Act. Um, Now, so the Affordable Care Act extended coverage to, so some people call it socialist medicine, or socialist kinds of government. Now, the Supreme Court case was over how the law was written and the meaning of 5 words. I forget what those 5 words were, but whether they were properly written. And so, in my view, it's better to be the person writing the laws than the person adjudicating the laws. But we've seen a lot of adjudication in the past. Maybe almost 2 months. For example, there was an executive order that denied birthright citizenship to children of people who are here undocumented or on things like visas. And so the judiciary had to adjudicate whether that was actually something the bureaucracy could do. One of the most, I think, high profile examples of this adjudication was whether the government could stop the payment of $2 billion through USAID. Maybe 2 days ago, the Supreme Court, actually on the day of that address to the joint session of Congress, the Supreme Court decided that the government had no power to stop the payment of that money. Now, how it's going to do that, nobody knows, because the agency has been taken apart. But these are examples of adjudication. And I know we are talking about the higher levels. If you go to court for, let's say you have a speeding ticket, that's an example of adjudication. They are trying to figure out, well, how much is what you did going to cost you? Now, think about something like driving under the influence. If someone goes to court for that, there's also a form of adjudication, and sometimes that might include pecuniary, monetary, or custodial outcomes. But so what we're trying to figure out is, or what we are getting at is, the judiciary's role is interpret, apply the rules that have been decided. And so sometimes there's flexibility. There's always negotiations around some of these issues. But so the judiciaries are concerned with civil law, settling disputes that are not of criminal nature, but also criminal law, which regulates people's behavior. I've always given the example of think about why people. So, for example, think about jaywalking. So jaywalking in many jurisdictions is a ticketable offense in the US. Now, in some other places, in some other countries, you can't really get in trouble for jaywalking. Literally everybody is jaywalking because you're sharing the road with vehicles and other things. So this doesn't become a thing. And so the American society has decided that jaywalking, well, in most jurisdictions, is an issue. And so these are examples of social control. Think about someone, say, caught. Now, I'm going to use an example that I really want to stay away from, but think about a crime or an infraction, for example, of public urination. Now, in this country, you can probably get in trouble for those kinds of things. In other countries, there are social costs. Like if you do that, everyone is like, you're the person who. And so these social costs stop people from doing certain things. And so think about how systems adjudicate things. Let me give you another terrible example. In Saudi Arabia, women cannot drive. It's against the law. If they do, they get in trouble. In fact, there's a woman who has been in jail for quite about maybe 7 years now, because every time she's released, she gets in a car and drives. Who decides that women can and cannot drive, and why? Now, apparently, the thinking behind it is that women driving in Saudi Arabia exposes them to moral corruption. There is a judicial body in Saudi Arabia called the Council for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. And so it's a one that regulates normal behavior. Like if you are a woman outside without a male relative, then you can get in trouble. And so again, these are examples of what laws, rules have been adjudicated or have been created, whether we agree with them or not. Last summer, maybe, or maybe it's 2 years ago, and you might remember the name of Masa Amini in Iran. So Iranian society has deemed it a good thing to wear a headscarf, and she decided not to. So again, think about freedoms. And so lots of people got in trouble. In fact, one of Iran's maybe most famous singers, secular singers, got a death sentence for protesting. So again, think about how laws are applied. They are applied through courts, and the personnel who determine or who, through a reading of the laws, can apply them and decide if someone has an infraction or if the government has an infraction, but also can sanction the transgressor, the person who violated the rules. Now, in some systems, there are religious courts. In other places, so you can find religious courts, constitutional courts, but also traditional systems that adjudicate some of these things. Think about, for example, divorce in Islamic societies. Now, so even if you live, for example, in the US, you might choose to use the Islamic courts interpretation or Islamic traditions interpretation of marriage and divorce. Now, here's where sometimes non-constitutional, well, not that is probably not a good way to So they are thinking about the different systems of adjudication. So, for example, Islamic courts are generally called Kadhis courts, um, or traditional systems. So, for example, councils of elders. Now, think about a community, for example, that practices child marriages. Now, and then consider that that country or whatever society that is, they live within a country. I'm thinking, for example, of Afghanistan and quite a number of African societies. So, if someone decides that they are going to marry off their 12-year-old child, that is proper according to traditions, but according to rules that society has set, that is probably marrying off a minor because we have decided that adulthood is at 18, and so you will find sometimes conflict between um, the system of courts that are in constitution, so for example, like district courts or the federal judiciary, with religious or traditional systems of adjudication. And so when you run into that, the question is, who takes precedence? Um, so think about, and this is the example of, so for example, Islamic countries sometimes do not have judicial structures. So for example, Saudi Arabia, what is their judicial structure? So sometimes they will adhere to certain types of law. So for example, Sharia law. And again, think about those maybe traditional systems, but judiciaries are often not completely independent. So think about the Supreme Court in the United States. Nearly everyone knows, for example, if a case comes before court, you can almost predict how the ruling will go. And so the question is that judicial independence, or is it judges who have decided what they are going to do? Now, again, sometimes you find some judicial independence. Um, some of the most recent judicial decisions in the US have really, like, it doesn't matter who appointed the judge. Some of these actions are so unconstitutional that all the judges are ruling against them. But so again, sort of think about these judicial structures, hierarchical structure. Supreme Court is up there, appellate courts are below it, district courts are below the appellate courts. And so if you have a federal issue, you will go to a federal district court, which also do other things like citizenship and those kinds of things. Now, if you have a state-based issue, then you go to the state courts. Now, state courts, like the Virginia Supreme Court, sometimes you can appeal their decision to other courts. Not always, but sometimes that. So that's a hierarchy that we are talking about. There's a concept called judicial review. And so this looks at the constitutionality of laws and actions. And so, for example, in the US, we often talk about checks and balances. And so, for example, let's say Parliament or Congress passes a law that is blatantly unconstitutional. Here's an example. If the current Congress passes a law that says citizenship will only go to people who either have green cards or are citizens, that would probably be purely unconstitutional. Um, and this is because to change certain things, you need to pass a constitutional amendment. And so you can't just do that using laws. And so this idea that the judiciary can review actions that Congress takes is what we call judicial review. Now, so think about styles of adjudication. So, for example, the Kadhis court, common law. Now, in the US, Sorry, that's my boss. Hello?